And we're recording. Thanks again, everybody, for joining me for one of my webinar interviews on my show. I am your host, Dr. Larry Chapp, retired professor of theology, owner and co-manager of the Dorothy Day Catholic Worker Farm near Harvey's Lake, Pennsylvania. I rarely introduce myself in these videos. So I thought today, it might be a good idea, since these goes up on YouTube, if I spend some time at least introducing myself just a little bit. So I also get a lot of these comments in the comment section sometimes about people complaining about the quality of the presentation isn't extremely professional and slick. It doesn't have a sort of Matt Fradd sort of look to it. And you're right. I'm using the camera off my computer. I do have this Shure microphone. Doesn't always work so great. I don't know what I did wrong. But anyway, I make no apologies for the Luddite quality of these videos. I think in some ways, perhaps, I hope it's part of their charm. Maybe actually, too, somebody could email me a prospective name for this show. I just call it my stupid webinar interviews, and there's no fancy YouTube name that I give to these things. But anyway, here we are. Once again, I have a great guest. My guest today is Michael Sauter, Sauter. I've known Michael for a few years now, and my main acquaintance with him was from a visit I made to the Abbey of the Genesee in Pifford, New York.
We say Piffard, but we're famous for these unpronounceable place names, Larry.
Oh, Piffard, is it really? It is. And all these years I've been calling it Pifford.
It's located about 5 miles from a town called Avon that other people would call Avon, and 8 miles from a town we call it Lima, but people would call it Lima, right? And it's the number of those small towns in Rochester, there's books written on the phenomenon.
Well, I went to school in Kentucky, and there's a Versailles, Kentucky, and I think every American state has these sort of things, but certainly, yes, I will now have to call it Piffard. Is that what you said?
Yeah, absolutely.
Piffard, New York, for the Abbey of the Genesee. And that's where I first met you and had some great conversations. And we both know Father John Gribowich, who I've interviewed, who's the co-owner of our farm. He's written on my blog. And I just want to say also, Michael used to work at the Abbey of the Genesee, did various ministries there for the Abbey. I knew him because he was kind of running the retreat center. He's also a chaplain at the SUNY. In Geneseo, right? You're still sort of a campus minister there at the SUNY campus in Geneseo. You also are a writer for Front Porch Republic. And
as often as I can.
I would highly recommend that my viewers go to Front Porch Republic and look up Michael Sauter, Sauter, or is it just Mike Sauter?
Both work. This will be one and only plug I have is that in the realm of Luddites who get onto computers, a common friend of ours, Michael Martin, and I started about 4 weeks ago a podcast. So you won't get to see our ugly mugs. It's called the Regeneration Podcast. But that's how did that relate to the last question you asked me? I'm forgetting it.
Because it's Michael Martin and Mike Sauter.
That's exactly the reason. You're one step ahead.
The reason why I didn't want to presume that your name was Michael necessarily is because my name is actually Larry and not Lawrence. And sometimes people make the mistake of introducing me as, it must be Dr. Lawrence Chapp. No, it's not. I hate the name Lawrence, and I'm glad I'm just a Larry, which is a really stupid 1950s name, as nobody names their kids Larry anymore.
I like the name Larry.
Well, thank you very much. You and about 5 other people in the whole universe.
The only time I've used Michael is my articles at Front Porch Republic. I think I submitted the first thinking almost a signature was needed, like the way I sign my checks. So maybe, I don't know. It was many, many years ago. The first one was Michael J. Sauter, like I would sign a check. Never used that in any other capacity, but there it goes.
And I would highly recommend, as I said, my viewers to go and Mike is a great writer and is very deep thinker. And the articles are really provocative and interesting. And I would highly recommend. And what's the name of your podcast with Michael Martin?
It's called, you can find it on Spotify and Podbean, and I think very soon Apple. It's called the Regeneration Podcast. And there we're doing this kind of sophiology thing, Larry. Everything that lives is holy, to quote William Blake.
Well, yeah, let's give Michael Martin a plug because he's been doing the sophiology stuff for a long time. And I'd love to get Michael Martin on this show as well. I also am in the process of trying to not only do YouTube videos, but to do more podcasts. I've been getting a lot of complaints from viewers who say, why can't you just do podcasts? It's that way I can still use my phone while I'm driving and listen to a podcast at the same time. I actually hate that because I put a podcast on my phone that I can't ever figure out how do I. This is boring. How do I shut this stupid thing
the
off?
opposite problem.
I'm like 10 tabs into the internet. I'm going, how do I turn off this godforsaken podcast? I can't figure it out. But anyway, I do want to do podcasts. I just don't know how. I have a tech guy. I'm going to have to ask him.
I think it's very easy. If I could figure it out, anybody could. I probably haven't figured it out well, but it's serviceable for sure.
Well, from one Luddite to another.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, so let's. So we've talked about your podcast. You're writing at Front Porch Republic, what you're doing, and why I think people should pay attention to you. But one of the things I think that really struck me, and this is what I want to talk about today. When you and I first met, I was struck by the fact that obviously you're a very Orthodox Catholic. Take your Catholicism very seriously, but you're also a guy, and I love this. You're a guy who isn't afraid to color outside the lines. A guy who's, I'm trying to avoid using that cliched phrase, he thinks outside the box, whatever the stupid box is. I just think you're a very provocative thinker, unafraid to go in directions that maybe other people aren't willing to go. To that end, you and I were discussing Ivan Illich long before, suddenly now in the past 2 or 3 years, he's suddenly all the rage all over again. I just got the Cayley book on.
It's excellent. I just got a letter from David Cayley this morning, and I call him the Wendell Berry of Canada because what he's done as a body of work, David Cayley, for so many years at the CBC is the most impressive thing that anybody. It's every college education. His series on Simone Weil, his series on Girard. He's interviewed Kavanaugh and Milbank, in depth and everything.
Yeah.
So many others, profound. And so him on Illich is a phenomenon. Not a great biography of Illich, but David Cayley on Illich is the thing. And I have a review of that book on Front Porch too.
Yeah, I have not yet looked into his video interviews with people, and as someone who's interviewed William Kavanaugh myself, I'd be interested in watching his listening to his interview of Kavanaugh. And really, I have to shout out to one of my viewers and readers, a guy named Cyrus Brewster, who's actually been at Genesee a few times. But it was Cyrus who texted me the other night after like a year ago after a few bourbons saying, you know what, you got to read this Cayley guy on Illich because he's just amazing. I had actually, and also these interviews, I'd never actually even heard of him before. So really? I want my viewers now to be turned on. Illich
or Cayley or both?
Both.
Really great. Wow.
Maybe to get at Illich through Cayley. Yeah. Cayley.
That's
and
it.
Gosh, what's the name of his latest book? Oh, shoot, it's downstairs. I don't have it here with me. I don't think so.
Anyway. After the Rivers North of the Future?
Yeah.
Okay, so he's done two on Illich. One was called, even back here, The Corruption of Christianity. And that was early on, or part moon, part traveling salesman was a series of interviews. But The Rivers North of the Future might have been the last book he wrote on Illich. And it was a series of interviews turned into CBC broadcast called The Corruption of Christianity.
That's probably it then. I didn't pay much attention to the title. I just dove straight into the book the other night after about my 10th bourbon and decided that it was probably, I exaggerate. It's hyperbolic. But after the first one, you lose track. So, this is apocalypse language here. Crisis language. Okay, so there you go.
The unveiling of Larry Chapp.
Yes. So Illich, let's get to Illich.
Sure.
What is it that, and then I'll talk about it. What is it that most intrigues you about him, and why do you think that his moment has returned, if you will?
Well, I think, for one, the definition of a radical, going back to the roots, everybody can play with the terms liberal, conservative, radical, progressive, and so forth. But what really strikes me about him, and I'll say that I've been reading him, at least for 25 years. I don't think he's written anything I haven't read more than once, but he truly radical. So when you read Cayley's book, how he kept the devotions, but he so inspiring that truly going back to the roots and liturgy, that he could be so forward thinking. And then the second one is that how he, his good friend, Lee Hoynacki at the end of his life, I think, was the first one to see that, one short way of telling Illich's story is that, he was writing on the church, and then he kind of got in trouble. And then you would think to an outsider that he shut up about the church for a while. So he was writing, Deschooling Society. He was writing Medical Nemesis. He wrote a book on energy, and conviviality. And his friend Lee Hoynacki, who had been a Dominican, and I think it's a great way to look at Illich, is that during those years he was writing epiphatically, right? This notion that Charles Taylor picks up, that modernity can be seen as, everything through the lens of the church. We can go into that.
Yeah.
But specifically that, because I've always been, working in schools. I never learned anything in school, but I always thought I liked books and so forth. So, Illich, he also, Larry, used liturgy. He helped me come to terms with the fact that though I liked learning, sitting in the liturgy of, square rooms under fluorescent lights with people your own age, that's kind of an odd liturgy. There's nothing that makes intrinsic sense that you learn with people your own age. In front of you might be somebody who's smart, but we don't know that, Larry. We know that he has a PhD if it's college. And he talked about the liturgy of schooling, that came from Comenius and came from alchemy, where you take, dross metal and turn it into gold. And he could show how the system by design was meant to cast people out. And so he revealed things about the world that helped to see hospitals clearly, helped to see institutions clearly. And at the same time, you could step outside and look at the church. One anecdote was that towards the end of his life, he wanted to see our century so clearly. And, one famous attempt to dispatch the evils of the modern time, he labeled it the age of disabling professions. And he said he labeled it that way as if you would name a demon to say, out with thee in the name of Christ. But the other things he did was through looking at things of liturgy again, he thought he could learn maybe Sanskrit to look at our culture from outside, but he said he was too late in life. That language beat him. So the only other way to do it was to go back to the 12th century, where he immersed himself so deeply in order to think like a 12th century person. Hugh of St. Victor would have been crucial in order to see our times. And all that stuff I just find mind-blowing and so revelatory. Every decision he made to see our world as it is was brilliant, and he worked hard for every insight he got.
Yes. I have to admit, I've never read his book on energy. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure.
I read his book on education, and I read his book on the medical establishment and institution. And it's not until just recently that I've come to really appreciate his insights into, in many ways, the madness of the institution of modern American medicine. It's only been recently since I've had a few minor sort of health issues and have had to negotiate the medical industry where I've begun to realize, is this the only way to pursue health? Is this the only way that we are to be channelized into, the pursuit of physical well-being? Because in many ways, my doctors have made me sicker.
Absolutely.
Instead of healthier. Mm-hmm. And every time I go to a hospital or whatever, I come out worse than when I went in. And what does that tell you about things? And the hoops that you have to jump through just to see a doctor. I have to have an MRI in a week for this little problem I have with my ear. But because I had a little issue with my kidney years ago and they have to put dye into me, I have to go get some specialized blood work, which I don't really care. Put the stupid dye in me and take my picture. But no, we're a litigious society as well. So they have to make sure that even if I decide to sue them, no matter what paper I might sign in advance, that I get that stupid blood work, which is another $500, $600, $700 into the system. And it's just a big shell game, the scam of various pieces that are all. And he saw this, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, longer than that? When did he write the book on medicine?
I wish I was good with those things, but it was well over 20 years ago.
Well, a long time
ago.
Yeah. Before a lot of my viewers were alive. But certainly, the thing that really struck me, being a college professor myself, and actually then having taught 4 years in an all-girls prep school before I taught on the college level.
I didn't know that.
Yes, I did. It was an all-girls Catholic prep school, Stewart Country Day School of the Sacred Heart in Princeton, New Jersey,
Wow.
run by Sacred Heart nuns. We call them the Gucci nuns because their schools are all in extremely wealthy neighborhoods like Greenwich, Connecticut, Princeton, New Jersey, things like that. They are the it's the prep school for girls from very wealthy families. So, anyway, it paid my salary while I was working on my doctoral dissertation. The point, though, is that I'm sort of really spent my entire adult life in the educational establishment, and that includes my time as a grad student, getting a doctorate, and so on. And so when I finally, Illich's book on education, the unschooling, was the very first book of his that I read. And I only read it, and I had never actually even heard of the guy. I only read it because somebody threw it at me and said, dude, this is sort of, 90s language. Dude, you got to read this. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, okay, I read it. And I thought, when did he write this? This is so prescient. This is so spot on. That like you were just talking about, the model of education that we have is designed to exclude. Mm-hmm. It's designed to winnow out. It's designed to push certain people to the top and certain people to the bottom. And there are so many things about it that are counter to fundamental principles of human nature that one wonders, what you just said just struck me so much because it was my experience too. When I read his book on education, I thought to myself, you know what? I don't think I ever really learned anything in school at all.
Yeah, and when I say that, I don't fault anybody else, but that medium of education, the liturgy of sitting in rooms with people my own age, it just didn't work for me. I went to less than 1/3 of my classes at college. I was told my roommates kept track. I didn't. But after I graduated, I read a book that led me to something else that led me to Illich. And then, it's Vladimir Soloviev, one of these great sophiologists in his famous poems, Three Meetings, which he had with Sophia. There's a great tagline that I might want as on my tombstone, but it would be, she, capital S pronoun, she chose my every book, right? And you can relate to that, how one leads to the other. Oh, yeah. But the benefit I had is, boring textbooks can kill the brain, right? So avoiding all that whole world, I never thought that, I never found reading to be boring. I just didn't do it. Consequently, but yeah, Illich, you mentioned counterproductivity, that it works for that pyramidal structure, just like the health. So health, education, and even transportation, which was part of energy and equity, that the very rich, the highways work for them, and the air system. But for the others, what it does is it also takes away the stuff that's at the lower level, like highways are where bikes should go, right? He also proved with energy and equity that when you take a car and you factor in the time that it's at the mechanics, the time it takes you to park out from the grocery store to walk in and back, you're actually moving, including the time you're sitting in traffic, you're at the gas station. You're actually moving at about 15 miles per hour when all is said and done. And that's the same speed as a freaking bicycle, right? But we can't, those bicycles aren't useful anymore because there was a monopoly on cars and so forth. So he draws attention to that. With regarding schooling, it works for the people who can afford it and who like that environment. But for those people, like I was in a kindergarten classroom. And again, when you look at schooling as a liturgy, and you look at the early years of education, you could have lessons in kindergarten and first grade on things like up and down, in and out. And Larry, those are things you couldn't not learn, even if you were locked inside a box. But those early years of formal schooling, the medium is the message, and it teaches you that all education comes through that rain dance, that liturgy, that system, right? So it's counterproductive because people just don't even trust themselves to read on their own about whatever subject that interests them. And the same thing true in hospital, that we're seeing an obesity epidemic, but it's not just that, a certain class of people can get access to the best medicine. That liturgy tells people to become dependent on doctors, right? And every doctors can fix everything. So the notion of taking care of yourself kind of atrophies.
Oh, it absolutely does. And every new pill that they give you from Big Pharma only takes you further and further down that rabbit hole,
Yeah.
because one pill is, like I always tell people, I'm on the pill. So I take a statin drug for my cholesterol,
Okay.
right?
Yeah. And it's useful, right?
Do I need it? I mean, you tell me, do I really need it? How do I even know? And this is kind of the point that I'm funneled into this system, which with all the money flowing upwards, that benefits mainly the wealthy class of CEOs and people that work for the big pharmaceutical industries, the wealthier doctors, all that. It helps them. But at the end of the day, is taking a statin drug really helping me or not? I take it dutifully because my doctor says, oh, yeah, you should take a statin drug because your cholesterol's through the roof. You might as I mean, how the heck do I know?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
And so it points to the need for more holistic approaches to the entire affair.
Absolutely.
Anyway, back to education, because this is what really boils me, is the fact that so much, we all know this. Let's put it this way: any serious academic, any serious intellectual, anybody interested in books and the intellectual life and big ideas and the arts and so on, you get the picture, right? Any person like that will tell you that the vast, vast, vast majority of what they have truly learned was through autodidact sort of reading on their own, conversations on their own. Or let's put it this way: I go to sometimes academic conferences. I hate listening to somebody present a paper. I rarely listen. I usually fall asleep. I usually daydream. I'm usually thinking about, I wonder what they're going to have for lunch later on. And the only real reason I go to these conferences is because I want to talk to people after the talks are over.
Absolutely.
I want to socialize with fellow scholars and so on over lunch, over drinks,
And those talks you listen to can be great. In my experience, I had to run the local parish as a layman for about 11 years. So I'd go to, and I'm thinking of it because it was the annual convocation of priests. And some of my buddies in the clergy just came back from the one in the Rochester diocese. And I forget who the speaker was for them this year, but it was, those presentations were always, they could be a touchstone for conversations at dinner and, between talks.
It can be.
Mm-hmm.
It can be. If they're presented in a way that's truly provocative and catalytic and gives you some ideas. I'm probably being overly critical. It's just
not you, Larry, not you.
The thing is, these conferences, I would say, 90% of the papers that you're forced to listen to are pretty, I think, pedestrian. And very few of them break new ground. Very few of them tell you something that A, you're interested in, or B, didn't know before you came to the conference. And so I agree with you. I have heard some talks that I perk up and say, whoa, what's this? An interesting talk. This person is saying something of value. This person is actually provoking us, poking us, wants to, catalyze us to a conversation. Anyway, my bigger point isn't simply to criticize the manner in which academic papers are read at you at conferences in rather dull and monotonous ways. The bigger point is that I would venture this guess that the vast majority of academics who attend academic conferences find the main value of those conferences to be the networking and the socializing you do with people outside of the lecture hall.
Absolutely.
Just as most of us learn what we learn through reading books that we're interested in rather than what we learn in the actual classroom.
Yeah, and counterproductivity could be there too. I don't have my PhD, but the great historian John Lukács, people found various ways of describing this phenomenon, but the current PhD involves knowing more and more about less and less, right? Because you have to specify so much.
Hyper-specialize, yes.
Yeah, and that can create, again, the medium being the message, that can create a type of academic who's very defensive about their territory and doesn't really like to go outside it. Another thing, to go back to Illich, that I admired is when you're multidisciplinary, he just threw himself in, like on the New York Review of Books. The great Christopher Lasch would do the same thing in a much more modest way. I think the first time I submitted something to Oh, Front Porch, a tiny little thing. A friend of mine that I kind of stalked because I liked his writings. Bill Kaufman lives about 30 miles from here. A lot of people maybe listening to this would know his name. But he was, kind of in early at Front Porch. But I don't know, I guess I had some ideas. I quoted Illich in this thing, but I just wanted to see if they fly, right? It's like Phronesis. I wanted to put myself into the mix. I can sit there and think I have some ideas, but how about you put them out and see if they hold water? The academic discourse seems pretty far removed from that in a different way, right? That you're kind of the medium makes you go into this narrow thing, and within that field, people are going to critique your papers. But look at the non-reproducibility crisis they're finding in double-blind studies and peer-reviewed things. It's right there for the telling.
Yeah, and it's not that our current educational system doesn't have any value at all.
Of course,
it's not. When I say I don't think I learned a damn thing when I was in school, I'm obviously exaggerating in order to make a point. I obviously learned something. And in any discipline, there has to be a baseline of simply empirical knowledge that your discipline, so of course I have a BA in philosophy as an undergrad. So of course I needed to go through this typical periodization of philosophical history. And here's the pre-Socratics, and here's Plato, Aristotle, and then all the way up through modern philosophy and so forth. So at least if somebody tosses the name Heidegger, Immanuel Kant out there at you, you don't stand there like, who? Like an idiot. Okay, so you have to have that baseline. But here's the problem. If that's all you get, you're not learning philosophy.
And you could do that. You could learn that same stuff in 1/10 the time. That's my allegation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just pick up a good 3-volume set of the history of philosophy that anybody with half a brain could absolutely read in a summer and dispense with the 6-semester course that you had to go through, which would have been then better to say this to me as an undergraduate in philosophy. All right, you're a freshman. Read the following 6 or 7 books over the course of this year to simply give yourself this empirical foundation, and then we'll sort of test you on it at the end. And then from this point forward, we're going to help you philosophize. We're going to actually help you to think philosophically, and we're going to do so by introducing you to the most interesting and provocative thinkers imaginable, thinking outside of the box in our culture today. And that might actually mean somebody who's thinking inside of the box in order to retrieve Plato. It doesn't necessarily mean all avant-garde, this, that, or the other thing. It just means you might be doing an even deeper dumpster dive into Aristotle and Plato than anybody's ever done before. And that then would be really interesting education. That would be powerful to do.
Speaking of outside the box on Plato and Aristotle, I can't recommend strongly enough a name, Peter Kingsley, an odd guy, but he's written on the pre-Socratics a lot, and recently had a book called Catafalque. It's one of these doomsday books that you'd be comfortable in, like it's all falling apart. But yes. What he does with Plato and Aristotle, it's revolutionary in our time. But I don't think I'm going to find him if I went over here,
Yeah. I was always looking for thinkers that would convince me that things are worse than I thought they were.
Yeah.
So that should be the motto of my YouTube show. Things are worse than you think they are.
I think you met your match, Larry. Yeah.
Yeah.
I can convince you they're pretty bad. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm as I've said in previous videos, I'm not a glass half full guy or a glass half empty guy. I'm a where the hell is the glass guy? You have a glass? There's a glass? Who has a glass? Right. So that's me, and that's what I do. But the thing is to go back to Illich and education. He put his finger on the fact that the institutional means by which we educate puts a premium on producing a certain kind of person, producing a certain kind of citizen that can be efficient and productive and make a living and know certain things, but isn't really producing a person, isn't really producing a human being. And because the education is not tailored to that human scale, that human way of actually learning something. And I hope you and Michael Martin in your discussions of sociology in your podcast, talk about what is it that's, to move on from Illich and maybe move on down to Martin and sociology. What is it that is lacking in modern education. I mean, we can critique all of the institutional aspects of it, as Illich has done, okay? But what would we add? What would we change? What would be? I would begin by simply burning the entire edifice down.
And last week you said with Gribb that you would burn the whole church down too, right? Yeah.
So I want to burn down the parish structure. Now I want to burn down the education.
Ladies and gentlemen, keep this gentleman away from gas cans and matches.
Yes. I want to emphasize, you kids don't try this at home, because I'm speaking purely figuratively, and I'm not.
Illich is a radical, and you're an incendiary, a true incendiary.
That's right. And my father's a fireman, so far.
Oh, that's great.
A retired firefighter. So far be it for me to encourage any kind of literal arson. But I am a devotee of Dorothy Day and Peter Moore, and I am a devotee of the true, the notion that our culture is deeply sick, and tweaking, this is my point, and it's sort of off topic, but I'm not actually apocalyptic in my thinking in this sort of end of the world, everything's going to hell in a handbasket sense, and only God can save us at this point. So I'm not a Latter-day Essene running off to,
nor am I.
Whatever.
Yep.
Yeah. However, I think we're in a seriously bad way. I think that modernity is characterized by deeply, deeply and profoundly unchristian and anti-Christian impulses, if we but had the eyes to see. And eventually, with the increase in technology and our ability to literally change our own physical structure technologically going into the future, interfacing with computer technology and so on, the chickens are going to come home to roost, and we had better had a better way of approaching our humanity than what modernity is providing to us. And so this is what I mean when I say things are worse than you think they are, because most people don't, I think, connect the metaphysical dots and see what the trajectory actually is. Not that I'm any great prophet. I'm just leaning on the analysis of others, and that's why I say things like burn it down. Yeah. Because I in other words, it's just a sort of stupid YouTube incendiary way of saying what a metaphysician might say is, you got to go to the roots. It's all wrong on the first principles. We need better first principles. But we're not going to get better first principles until the first principles we're working under now go away. Yeah. And how is that going to happen? I don't know. Go ahead.
Well, we mentioned, that I think we can get off Illich too, because, if he used alchemy as one way to say, where did the modern rain dance, the liturgy, the institution of schooling come from? But the other one, for all these things, we talk about technology a lot, but just like the word participation was huge in Aquinas, but it's not talked in much, neo-scholasticism, our implication in the world. But for Illich, he had great books predicting what would happen with technology, but also remember just the industrial mode of production, influenced how we look at schools. And the industrial mode of production by nature, in his work, Gender, he showed that when a man and a woman on an assembly line in the equivalent of genes, that was the first reduction, the reduction of gender to just a human being in one sense. We were desexed. In the industrial mode of production did that. When it's brought to schooling, you have, 12 to the dozen, right? So when the calling of our faith, the calling of the gospel, the calling of our time too, is the human person, the individuality, the irreducible, personality and so forth. When that's what we're talking about in church, and yet our Catholic colleges have a theology class, but really aren't they all married to business schools, right? That have this kind of, they are. That we haven't in our institutions, and that's maybe why Mike Martin and I are always talking about those outside institutions, that we've lost them. So there was a real great, Stratford Caldecott, that name. He was doing what Mike Martin and I are interested in, and it's not a fetishization of Waldorf, but he was trying to take the insights of all these different school systems, one of them being Waldorf, associated with the name Rudolf Steiner. And boy, I mean, if you talk about an untimely death, that was one, because I think those people who are interested in that, there's a lady Michael and I interviewed just last week, Tara Thieke. Take note of her name, find her on Front Porch. One of the greatest.
Spell her last name.
Tarathike. It's actually Tara Thieke. Google her name, and she was one of the most She's a mom of 4 staying at home, so she used Twitter until, it's going to kill your brain. But she and Michael and I can talk about this. And, that's one of the ways out of this is there's no place when you say coloring outside the lines, like you introduced me. And I appreciate that. I don't know if I'm up to that task, but we can't not take our cues from anything. Nothing is out of bounds for us to take, cues at this point where it's all falling down. And as Catholics, I don't know why we put so many shackles on our brains, but we do.
Yeah,
we do. And again, it's because, I don't know. It's very easy to go outside once you're kind of centered in Christ, I find, but, so the industrial mode of production in medicine, in transportation, but education, that's where we are. That factored it. And then when you bring in technology, you have Illich predicting everything that would happen. But what you really see now, and I'm going to bring in these names, Ian McGilchrist, who wrote The Master and His Emissary. He's a great psychiatrist in Britain. And I had finished a book some weeks ago about a psychologist who wrote a book on William Blake. But it's, what all these people are getting to is the bicameral brain. And we have the hypertrophy of the left brain, right? This analytical mindset, and consequently the total atrophy of the poetic way of thinking. And to me, that's a way of looking at the school system. And so we could come at it with jargon, which isn't going to do anybody anything. More arts in schools, sure. But let's get serious about this and let's get concrete. What does that look like?
I think this is so. I could talk to you for 10 hours about this. Maybe we'll have to do another show, and maybe I could be a little better prepared next time to actually, delve even. I didn't think we'd go so deeply into education as we are. I thought we'd move on to Preperata, but maybe we can do that later. Anyway, the deal is what you just struck a chord with me. Are you familiar with the thinker, the late Italian philosopher, Augusto Del Noce? By any chance? Yeah. I'm a big fan of Del Noce.
Most of mine is derivative from the great work of Lancelotti, who's doing, put him on the map for me. And so I've read all those articles. I have all of Del Noce's essays. They're tough going, right? But they're very rewarding.
Yeah. Well, one of the things about Del Noce, I think, that makes him difficult to read but also beautiful to read, is that he writes like an Italian.
He does.
And an Italian philosopher will often sort of circle the issue before he finally Giussani sort of writes in a similar way, a communal liberation. Nevertheless, it's beautiful. But anyway, the point I want to make is that Del Noce, one of his big points is that the religion of modernity is scientism. Reductionistic materialism and scientism, and that language, the language of science, is considered the only truly public form of reason in our culture, in our civilization. And that's why even the soft sciences of sociology, psychology, and so on have to, in some ways, parrot the hard sciences in order to, and even now economics and education, the same thing. You've got to parrot the language of the hard sciences in order to justify your place at the academic table as a form of public reason. Now, this has the net effect then of reducing, especially the sciences of the human being, reducing our anthropology, our understanding of what it means to be a human being, to utterly materialistic categories. Now, why am I bringing that up? I'm bringing that up with regard to education, because one of the things Illich and others, I would throw Del Noce in there, it noticed was that any educational system that brackets the question of soul or spirit or God or the realm of value or the realm of transcendence, that brackets that as ultimately, number one, at best, irrelevant to the educational enterprise, and at worst, inimical to the educational enterprise, is an educational system that is designed to create terribly truncated and attenuated human beings.
By design.
By design. So I'm thinking, you're absolutely right, that the factory model, the industrial model of education that you were talking about, right down to the desks all lined up in rows, okay, with the teacher in the front and regulated with bells and whistles and clocks and, it's like, okay, it's time to move on to the next. Okay, got that. Factory model. So I remember in my middle school years, in the 70s, yes, I'm old, The educational establishment of my hometown of Lincoln, Nebraska, and I went to public school, decided that factory model has to go. So down came the walls between classrooms. Out
we know how this ended, right?
Yeah, all out went the rows of chairs, out went the bells and the clocks. They took all the clocks out of the room, and now it was just this free-flowing sort of experiment in self-learning that was supposedly the latest thing. Okay, I give them credit for recognizing that there was something wrong with the factory model. But here's my point. Their vision of education and their vision of what, as Wendell Berry goes, what are people for?
Crucial.
Okay. Their vision of that was still materialistic. Mm-hmm. Their vision of that was still industrial. You can move the chairs around, but all you were doing was creating citizens more adept at working for Apple than for working for Ford. Okay.
Completely and utterly. Yeah.
Yeah. So my point that the revolution in education that Illich was pointing to and others is more than simply a critique of the industrial model or certain institutionalized and channelized pathways that favor the rich and exclude others. It was actually a much deeper critique and analysis of the undergirding metaphysical, spiritual values or the lack thereof in the entire.
Well, let me say, it's an odd historical connection, and somebody still has to write a book on it. But we know that Rudolf Steiner was a frequent visitor to the Illich home on an island in the Adriatic in Croatia. And we know that Ivan Illich's grandfather, that Rudolf Steiner was Ivan Illich's grandfather's astrologer. It's just like Rod Dreher says, we have to make it weird. But in order to get beyond this hegemony that you're talking about, beyond just the industrial mode of production, this word kind of science is always trying to grab even those things that ostensibly are put forth are kind of to bust out of that. It's just not true. That's why I'm often lately going back to William Blake, because we can make the Abbey the Genesee connection with Thomas Merton and so forth too. But Kathleen Raine, one of the great Blake scholars of all time, would say that the whole corpus was science versus the imagination, right? If we're looking for political categories, if we're looking to get out of Republican and Democrat, liberal and conservative, let's talk about science versus the imagination. And I still think, that even our people, too much of the language of scientism, Larry, still has implied is this kind of, even in the hands of a dear friend, somebody I admire so much, which is Bishop Barron. Quite often and it's been in some of his writings, but we see it everywhere. I'm guilty, I'm sure, in some sense myself. We were at a cocktail party and we still want to say like Lemaitre was a Catholic, Copernicus was a Catholic, this type of thing.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So we need to go deeper, and we need to say that how one trains the brain and how the other one does, and what happens to the human being when that one hypertrophies and the other one atrophies.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I absolutely hate it when Catholics try to defend the Catholic faith or the consonance of Catholicism with modern science by bringing up examples of very astute scientists who also happen to be devout Catholics. Copernicus was a Catholic. Even Galileo died a faithful Catholic. And of course, Lemaitre, he developed the Big Bang Theory before, anybody else and so on.
Yeah, it shows which religion's the dominant one and which is playing handmaid. And it's the Catholic Church playing handmaid to the religion of science, right?
Yeah, exactly. It also does nothing to, in a sense, prove, it could just be that Copernicus, Lemaitre, and others were rather bifurcated individuals.
Yeah, right.
Okay, that were able to compartmentalize their faith from their science.
Yeah.
Show me a work that any of them that produced that actually integrated in a sophiology, if you will.
Yeah, right.
The science that they were doing with the theology that they knew to produce this grand synthesis. Okay, then I might be impressed and say, oh, okay, this is interesting.
There's an analog, parenthetically, there's an analog there in our church and the faith with the social justice tradition of the Catholic Church, which is, it's always, seeking to curry favor again by saying, oh, don't you know that we believe in fair trade coffee? I'm like, for the love of God, and, to use Illich, he called most of what goes by the name social justice, and boy, did he believe in it. But he was willing again to go back to the roots in one sense. But he said it was the institutionalization of envy, right? Instead of going at envy, It's just like give everybody the fair share of envy. And then a hero of mine, Jean Sullivan, a French novelist, Catholic, heir to Bernanos. He called it the reorganization of universal greed. And I've always loved those two little pithy statements, that this tradition that we talk about, whenever it's there, we just use it to kind of curry favor, throw a pebble in that pond to say, hey, we're here too. We're kind of in the science realm. We have some people on our bench did some work in that field, and it just drives me nuts.
We believe in the universal destination of goods. Therefore, we're right on board with you guys too.
Right.
Raise all the boats out there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Without any deeper analysis of which boats you're raising and why, and what's really involved sociologically in making everybody rich and everybody greedy and everybody a materialist. So these are maddening questions, but does go back to the original point, which is the language of scientism, as Del Noce points out, is the religion of our time.
It is, of course.
And the church has to play handmaiden to that all the time in order to justify itself. And my point would be, without a restorationist recrudescence of some kind of really, backward-looking theology that simply rejects all of modern science, there's no need for that kind of servile approach. The church actually has something profound to offer to our modern understanding of science that goes way beyond simply showing how there's concentric circles and there's an overlap in the middle, and that part's where we can have a conversation. I call that the Templeton Foundation approach to science and religion. I was involved in that. I got Templeton grants. I wrote books on science and religion. That's the coin of the realm.
So you're telling me, I saw you had that book out. You're telling me not to read that book. Was that a previous iteration of Larry Chapp?
No, go ahead and read it.
Okay,
I mean, because you would be about only the eighth person who has. It's called The God of Covenant Creation, Scientific Naturalism, and its Challenge to Modern Faith. And what it is, it's an application of Balthasarian Trinitarian ontology, ressourcement communio Trinitarian ontology, on the question of the relationship between God and the world, transcendence and immanence, and how that then can answer questions. It is pertinent to what we're talking about because, here I'll stand up for Bishop Barron because he talks about
he's great. Don't get me wrong.
We have to get beyond competitive transcendence, a notion where, and that's the deal. It's always in these discussions. Well, either creation or evolution. Either God did it or nature did it. It's either nature or it's grace, and it's never the sort of robust both and that can be cliched too. So the trick here in these conversations is to do a deep dive into what we mean by the both and. What's the metaphysics that undergirds the both and?
Well, how about the cosmology? Where I kind of hang my hat is, there's a higher. The great pattern in history is from, original innocence to complication to for Owen Barfield, it was original participation to alienation to what they called, final participation. But in Christopher Lasch, in his writings, he saw, like in Western music, you had this kind of primal oneness in a great symphony, and discord was entered in, and that discord is brought into final resolution. So that's a pattern that means a lot to me, and anybody who knows me knows I think in those patterns. But there's a lower geocentrism, then there's a higher geocentrism. That, Larry, if you build a telescope 15 times more powerful than the Hubble telescope and you shoot it out 15 billion more light years further than the Hubble telescope, the only thing that's going to read the data is a human eye or a human ear, which when you water it down becomes dirt, right? And the name atom is, it's somehow we're always still central. But that, the old geocentrism, but similarly, there's a cosmology of man as, the microcosm within the macrocosm. And that's going to come back with a vengeance. We have Mike Martin and I are talking about it all the time. And my youngest of 4 children is 21. And I'm not so sure everybody's aware of how pervasive it is, but probably more women than men. But like astrology is making a roaring comeback. Now, again, we could make all these qualifications and say, like, of course, it's not the weekly horoscope, whether this guy is going to like you and so forth. But some of the young women are very, very knowledgeable about this. And if you were going to teach a college course, if you just wanted to yoke it onto something, like somebody could yoke a course onto the popularity of The Sopranos some years back or anything else, it's ubiquitous, astrology. And at least, that has the benefit of it's humanizing the cosmos again. I'm going to mention the name William Blake again, but I find it so many of my writings at Front Porch, I call it to my own children. I call it my major trilogy, which is also my minor trilogy. But I look at, in various articles, I look at the notion that completely and arbitrarily, anybody can go to a website called Scale of the Universe. There's like 50 iterations of this thing. And you can scale out to the farthest known reaches of the universe, and you can scale down to like the Planck length. But it turns out they could go infinite, Zeno's paradox on one side and just keep on going further on the other. It turns out then that we're larger than the smallest thing we know, than we are smaller than the largest thing we know. But let me qualify that and say we could go infinitely. But we've sided on one side of the equation the whole time, how puny you are, Larry.
Yeah.
And in the words of Stephen Hawking, that you're just completely negligible. But so we need to say, when somebody wants, Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or somebody wants to blast off in popular, I say shrink yourself, because I think it does less environmental damage, and try and colonize a small like atom, or like cut a grain of sand and see if there's intelligent life on that, because it's totally relative. We valued one side of the equation at the expense of the other magisterially. The great German Thomas Mann, this was a central theme in his writing. And again, you find it in Chesterton, you find it in Wendell Berry, you find it in Dostoevsky, these people who noticed it. But the humanizing of the cosmos out there is very important. So William Blake, and this is where I'll end this little monologue, he saw that as so central. This modern mindset that he would attribute to the three antichrists, Newton, Locke, and Bacon, his three antichrists. This notion of like cold, dead space, he saw was the seed that was going to lead to, in one sense, it would take me several more conversations to underlie the whole thing, but it underlies this whole thing, to repeat myself, that he saw the whole thing as a human body, right? Maybe inside out. I'm still trying to piece that together.
Along those lines, the great Jewish philosopher Hans Jonas had a great essay. I can't remember the name of the book that the essay was in now, where he pointed out, and this always struck me, and it's right in line with what you're talking about. He always pointed out that for the ancients, life is what is ubiquitous in the cosmos. Rocks, rivers, the moon, the sun, the stars, not just what we in moderns would call living things, but everything that had a vitality to it was considered in some form alive. So for the ancients, it was those things that appeared dead and inert that were anomalous and needed explaining. How do you fit those things into the nexus and the matrix of our cosmology, which is largely one of life?
Yeah.
It has been utterly reversed in the modern world, where the baseline, the default position, is that everything is inert, lifeless, dead, and that it is life that has somehow arisen by pure randomness out of blind forces, and it is life that is anomalous.
It's ridiculous, Larry. I'm here to tell you, and I'll die on this hill. It's crazy.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, one place people can turn is, in trying to teach this, I adjunct on and off at the local university, is I think it's fun. The name, again, in my pantheon of heroes, is John Cooper Powys, a great Welsh novelist. These novels of 900 pages. George Steiner said, he was the only writer in English to remind people of Dostoevsky, but he's a name we need to reckon with. But you could Google it at archive.org or gutenberg.org, a book called, there's a chapter in a book, one of his early ones. The title of the book will come to me. But it's called The Illusion of Dead Matter, And these people, and these people who
I haven't read this, but I gotta get it.
Yeah, and the vital, it's a 3-word title, like the vital current or something. It's got a but he was just saying, and I'll mention this. Father Gerard, the abbot of the monastery, read this book, and he could discern 13 faculties in his soul. And I can quote Father Gerard right now, and he would say, "I've never seen or witnessed such powers of introspection as with this, genius novelist." But he helps me see something that I tell this anecdote a lot, but to a depressed French poet, matter seems more congealed and more dead to it does to somebody with vitality, right? I don't know why I throw the word French in there, but, I could be sitting here and writing poetry and saying the walls mock me. They remind me of death. But to a very vital person, matter doesn't look as dead. And to a highly vital person, to William Blake, matter was shimmering with life. And to Powys, who had these powers of introspection. So the illusion of dead matter, it's called The Complex Vision, is the title of the book at archive.org. It's a little work of genius. It's just, he's trying to figure it out. He could settle himself so much and look at what was going on inside. And he also talked about free thinkers. He wondered what the role of Christ was in this. And these are people we need to read. We need to read these people.
I was reading a book by Giles Bailey called God's Gamble. And he has a section in there. He's very Girardian. He loves René Girard. Right. In fact, I'm going to be presenting at a conference in San Francisco in November, a conference format that I was just criticizing half an hour ago. I will be a presenter, and so will he.
Well, you're going to enjoy the conversations after your talk, even if you don't enjoy your own talk.
The difference, though, is before I get back to my point, the difference now is that I've retired and I don't give a damn. Awesome. So I can, obviously I do care, but I'm not. In other words, I've done my bit for king and country, and I don't care about tenure or advancement or rank or professional standing. I think it's one reason why my blog has hit a nerve with some people. I'm often wrong, but I shoot from the hip, and I'm just honest and so on. But anyway, the point that he makes in this book, to bring this to Christology, I can't remember the author he's quoting. He doesn't come up with this term himself, but he's quoting somebody else. He refers to the fact that Christologically and talking sophiologically, what we're talking about here is that if we are all in Christ, then it implies a certain omni-subjectivity that we all share. And I would extrapolate from that, and I think he does too, if I remember correctly. It's an omni-subjectivity. We not only share corporately one human being to another, but with the entire cosmos. And it is because we are all members of the body of Christ. And this is not a mere metaphor. We're really members of this corporate body of Christ, which is cosmic Christ. Have you ever run across that term before, the omni-subjectivity?
Yeah, again, I'm going to say William Blake. It seems implicit in all he does. He leads people to the question: do we say? And I think this is revelatory because this endless space thing, right? To a very large thing, what we call endless space is one anecdote I often share too. I have a good friend who's a gardener, and I told him how some people will plant their cucumber seeds based on the position of Venus. And again, you have to laugh that off. It's too far; they can't be connected. But you can the retort is easy to say that to a very, very small thing, the difference between the cell wall and the nucleus is farther than the distance between a cucumber seed and Venus. But nobody denies those connections there. But we've got a different religion. But so a kind of a revelatory question that's thought-provoking for me, is Jesus God or is God Jesus, the human form divine? Right? It has, in a nutshell, it can bring that whole notion that the modern cosmology kicks so far out into the distance that God can't possibly keep the whole world in his hands or care about one fallen soldier in a ridiculous war. But, is Jesus God or is God Jesus? Because, the cosmology might be the human form divine, and that's the cosmos.
Yeah. That's a great way of phrasing the question. And a lot of people might not get the subtlety of the distinction to be made here. Is Jesus God or is God Jesus? But I think it's an enormously important, in some sense, of course, both statements are true. Yeah. That's not the point. The point is one of starting point. The point is vantage point. I'm reminded of the late, great Edward.
I have you stalled a little bit. I don't know if it's on my side. I don't know if you lost me or I lost you, Larry.
Oh, there we are.
There, cool.
I'm sorry about that. We've moved the operations back to our farm, and out here in the hinterlands, internet can be a bit sketchy. My wife warned me about this. This is the first time it's actually in my interviews that
it didn't last that long at my home. I'm in my office here at my home. That same little snafu could last 20 minutes or something.
Well, good. Well, maybe it's not a problem on my end. Maybe it's all your fault. But anyway, my late great dissertation director Edward Oakes wrote a great book on Christology called "Infinity Dwindled to Infancy." And the whole gist of his book was a long meditation on just think about this for a second. How is it possible for God to become a human being? Right? Not in some sense for a human to be elevated into divine status. So Jesus is God, but no, God is Jesus. Mm-hmm. And that's a far more unsettling, decentering, and provocative statement. In fact, it's what is shocking and scandalous to other monotheists, Muslims and Jews,
for sure,
who say what you are asserting is by definition impossible.
Yeah,
that God cannot do that without changing, and yet that is the claim.
Yeah, like we're all deists now, right? In one sense, and we can change that. And I think through all the massive changes that are going on in the world right now, I think we are seeing a classic kind of one of these cycles of history, whether it's Spenglerian or Toynbean. But these things could be predicted. Where the reign of abstractions. Again, for Blake too, you were saying how you're not apocalyptic, nor am I. But at least for William Blake, what you needed at a certain point in civilization's trajectory or in history's trajectory was you needed the congealing of all evil so it could be cast out. I love that notion, right?
Yeah. You congeal it so you can sort of localize it and then cast it out.
Yeah, when everything's an empire of lies, that all of a sudden it can all come together. Then all of a sudden you can just send it away. You can name it and say, in the name of Jesus Christ, leave now.
Okay, well,
cool.
Okay, so we're running short of time,
sure.
But I wanted to at least maybe we've got about 10 minutes. I don't like these videos to go much longer than an hour and 15.
Yeah.
For a lot of reasons. One, attention spans. Another has to do with computer processing.
My own included.
Yeah. So the point is I want to talk about a thinker that you introduced me to.
Yeah.
An Italian thinker, Guido Preperata.
Yep.
And has written some very provocative things. Now, in like the 10 minutes or so that we have left, why don't you set the stage for a conversation? Maybe it's a conversation we could continue in another video if you would be open to it. What is the essence of Preparata's insights? And how do they kind of relate to a great extent what we've been talking about?
Yeah. So we could have him on sometime. I speak with him most weeks. He had been at the Gregorian. I can't say enough that I don't know what genes do for intelligence. It's proven that some of the greatest love stories are childless. Romeo and Juliet, Petrarch and Laura. But his dad was, famously, you can Google the name Giuliano Preparata, was in a public fight with Richard Feynman, a young upstart. He represented the next wave. And there's poems and limericks written about this. But Guido comes from good stock and had a great intelligence, but he also happens to be one of the, he's a good and just man, fiery. But he got good training. He got fired from the University of Washington, for a book he wrote on kind of geopolitics in the 20th century called Conjuring Hitler. And it's worth a read. And then he wrote a book called The Ideology of Tyranny. So, it's very commonplace now when we're all talking about Illich to say that the goal of the excesses of woke culture is to give us all these diversionary things as the elites, just go on their massive heist, this massive plundering thing. But he wrote this book called The Ideology of Tyranny, and it's definitely the best in its field. And wrote it at a way anybody can understand, Palgrave Macmillan, and I discovered him through those books. And then when he was at the Gregorian, wrote a book called New Directions in Catholic Social and Political Thought. And again, I have a review of this book that is at Front Porch Republic. And it's a good one. And Guido, we became friends because he thought I got it. I developed so many friendships with authors because, oh my God, you get it.
Yeah.
In a nutshell right now, the big one, Larry, would be we need to find those thinkers who get that. Is economics or power the driving force? And I don't want to reduce him to this. But, it took me a while to be trained out of the false notion that economics, like banking, was the thing that ran the show. It's really power. And now, again, that's for a whole show. But once you get that power is the thing driving the game, a whole universe of insights open up. And that's what he's done for me. And it allows him, even though I said power is the thing that plays the game, it allows his insights into economics to be fruitful in a way that our left and right and our distributists kind of holding the middle, as Mike Martin would say, with some cosplay but no plans, He's,
Yeah.
he's really working at, developing local economies from the bottom up. And one of the linchpins, again, we've very short time, but, let's look at usury, right? The Catholic encyclical Vix Prevenient is still out there. A lot of people see that maybe in the decline of Rome, compound interest grows faster than cancer, grows faster than any tree, faster than the Fibonacci series or whatever. It's ungodly and it's unnatural, but it's always in mythology equated to the scorpion's bite. It starts to hit a society, then eventually it'll bring the whole thing down. But the answer to that, Guido can't take credit for, but he goes, I wish I could. But it came up with an interwar German Brazilian businessman named Silvio Gesell, and the answer is called perishable currency. So today, maybe I just need people to kind of like mark down those words, perishable currency. The great lie, while Dante put usury so low, is that it wasn't fruitful. When Shakespeare says, you think your ducats sit in a bank and breed like rabbits, when we think that something unnatural is fruitful, that money sits in a bank and breeds, that might be the lie at the center of history. And the way out of that is to issue currency. Leon Bloy, Pope Francis quoted Leon Bloy. He's on a picture behind me, one of my heroes,
yes,
on his first homily. But Leon Bloy knew that phenomenologically, money had to be seen as blood in the Bible and vice versa. It has to circulate. The problem that we're seeing now with stagflation and the boom-bust economy is the issue of hoarding. When Tolkien when he wrote The Lord of the Rings, you have dwarves who hoard, all this hoarding. But perishable currency, it allows money, it has to circulate because it represents everything that money was supposed to represent that perishes, right? And so that's central to him. But then his economic insights and his insights into geopolitics, and also science, because his dad was, I don't know, maybe the premier scientist of the 20th century. Let's end on conspiracy theory. Google the name Bill Gates and cold fusion, and you see all of a sudden Bill Gates, who's buying all the farmland, is also throwing untold billions into cold fusion. Preperata was canceled. He was tenured at NYU in his 20s, canceled because he said to Feynman, you're against cold fusion because your whole standard model of physics is wrong, right? But nobody can drop the standard model of anything. And this guy is for real. We can have him on. I can be kind of his interpreter, or his Huxley to his Darwin. But he has a field day with people like Darwin. He just thinks it's so ridiculous that Darwinian science, it just worked for the British Empire. That sounds crazy, but it's also true. It's
very true.
Yeah, it's very true.
And I would love to have him on. Let's make that happen.
Let's do it.
Because also in the ways that he connects this with the Catholic thing.
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah.
And with Catholic, that's the best way to put it. You've sent me some things to read by him, and I emailed you back and said, look, I want to sign on to this project. I want more of what this guy is selling.
It's a lot.
It's like I said, it's like trying to take a sip of water from a fire hose, and it's blaring, and you're going, well, you're lapping at a few drops here and there. Let me assimilate. I'm still processing this guy. He is, in fact, what I've read of him, he's the most outrageously original thinker I have come across in a very long time.
Yeah.
And I'm not certain if he is a genius or he's insane or both.
He'd be fine with that.
It's just astounding stuff, and how he relates it to the faith. I would love to read more of him and then have him on and have you be the sort of interpreter.
Yeah, it's kind of like an Illich thing. And I'll say one provocative statement of his, and to replug this podcast, the Regeneration podcast, Mike Martin and I had him on, and we'll have him on regularly. He's a good friend now. But he was saying that, he would, when he was at the Gregorian, people would give him all these encyclicals because I forgot him the minute I read them. And he was searching for the term. And even in theology circles, he couldn't handle over there that people could begin a conversation saying, as a neo-Thomist, right? So he's allergic to the right things. But he said he was looking at all this Catholic jargon and he called it, in real time, he's thinking through and he just said it's discursive ballast, maybe 95% of it. And as a Catholic myself, a mass-going Catholic, I find that freeing.
Discursive ballast is one of the best phrases. I might be... Wow, I'm going to be.
Take it as your own. Take it as your own. Nobody's going to sue you.
Let's just say that I have never found magisterial documents to be all that riveting or
Yeah.
cogent. Encyclicals top of the pile.
Yeah.
For example, I would always have people say to me, very right-wing Catholics, how come in your theology classes you don't assign more papal encyclicals for the students to read? Why don't you give everybody a catechism to read? And I thought, well, if you want to make them hate the church, that would certainly be what I would do.
Yeah, or put them to sleep. Put them to sleep.
Well, because it is so boring.
Yeah.
And is just discursive ballast, blah, blah. And once again, neither Preperata nor I am saying that the encyclicals don't have a value on their own level.
True.
In the sense of a cumulative weight of a certain tradition and a certain linguistics, a certain manner of speaking. Yeah. Got that. But there's also in other words, if you reduce theological language to that, if you reduce the faith to that, oh my goodness, are you poverty stricken? Yeah,
the visionaries are the ones that are out in front, right?
Yeah,
you're creating that
and I'm not a sort of let's tilt at windmills kind of. That's not the point.
No,
the point is we're dealing with the mystery of God and His transcendency, the triune God, which means it should be something that is constantly exploding our old wineskins.
Yeah.
All right. Staying within the dogmatic tradition of the church, there are still exploding wineskins all over the place.
There are.
And that's why, like I don't mind neo-Thomists, but when they start talking as if you must stay in this straitjacket, you must stay inside the parameters of this sandbox. Otherwise, you are straying outside of the boundaries of legitimate Catholic discourse. That's when I part ways.
Yeah, and if it wasn't gone 10 years ago, Larry, it's completely and totally gone now.
No.
That way of talking. Yep.
I agree. Mm-hmm. Anyway, we're out of time.
So much fun.
And let's do this again. There's so much more I want to talk about. I came in here thinking we were going to talk more about Preperata, not so much about Illich and education, but that really got my juices going.
The world is our oyster. Awesome.
Yeah, so let's do this again. And thanks to everybody for hanging with us. And
say hi to Carrie and good luck with the planting season on the farm, Larry.
Oh, gosh, yeah, we're up in it now. Hang on a second. I'm going to hit the stop record button.
Okay.